Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to have a schmooze day, which means that there's no agenda. I'm going to bring together three people who don't know each other, and let's see what we all find to talk about. In Ottawa is Réal Laverne, and am I pronouncing the way you like to have your last name pronounced?
Absolutely not.
Tell me how you'd like to be known.
If you think of the old show, the sitcom Laverne and Shirley, that you get pretty close. So you could just
Laverne.
put a little "ñ" at the end, Laverne, and you got it.
Laverne and Réal. Okay, very good. Thank you. And in Berlin is Rainer Brown. I should say that Réal is very involved with Fair Vote Canada. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's an organization that's very much devoted to trying to improve our voting system, and I'm all in favor of it. He's also working with Citizens Assembly, which I think is a great idea. In Berlin, we have Rainer Brown, whom I have known for a long time. I don't see much of you, but we've been long time acquaintances. And Rainer is now the director of the International Peace Bureau, which is a very long-standing umbrella organization of peace movements around the world. Very important, won a Nobel Prize way back at the very beginning. And in Texas is Frank Cronkite. And Frank and I are trying to figure out how we know each other. All I know about him is so far that we did have a conversation once, which he's forgotten. And I think he joined in one of my monthly global town halls. And I believe we talked, I don't know what we talked about then, but I think it had something to do with your activism during the Vietnam War. And I believe you're a theologian, and we'll find out more as we get going. So the thing about a schmooze day is that I don't tell people what we're going to talk about. We're going to discover what we're all interested in. So I'd like for Frank to start us off by telling us what it is that's on your mind lately and that you think that we should all pay some attention to.
One of them was the fact when I was in prison for destroying draft offices here in Minnesota, I was invited to a meeting of the Black Panthers and a Black sort of consciousness group. And so, and I talk about, prisons are just sort of crazy places. And after prison, I go on and study all about prisons in my doctoral work at Berkeley. And but I come to find out that for Black men, the military was a way of getting out of the ghetto. It was a way of getting an actual job. So again, after prison, I spent 25 years in the corporate world, and I came to understand there, for women, men, gay people, et cetera, the avenues that were open to me was not open to them. So that was one sort of awakening. And the other thing was the humorous thing I was trying to tell before we sort of went live here, is I was once having, for lack of a better term, a luncheon with Daniel Ellsberg up in Berkeley, and he was a witness at our trial, which is another story. And at one point, he asked me, I sort of said, like, we're sitting out in the public. Aren't you afraid someone's going to come up and kill you? And he leaned over to the table. He said to me, Frank, it's what I know about nuclear war that they're afraid of. And so all of a sudden, I went to prison. I had a 5-year sentence. I will talk about that another time. I did 14 months, and we were fighting the war. And he was sort of saying, yeah, well, the real war is the fact is that the state of North Dakota is the third most powerful nuclear nation in the world. You look at North Dakota, yeah, they have all these silos in the ground. Mm-hmm. And if you, even now on the net, so you wonder what's the real story, because if it's available on the net, it's old news. But all across the northern part of our country, north central, northwest, where the states were then, they're getting more populated now, but they were the least populated. The military moved in and embedded all these bombs. So I'm very interested in what you guys are doing, because I myself am struggling right now. I'm post-stroke for 5 years, sort of just able to get back to sort of doing some stuff. teaching,
I'm sorry,
talking.
did you say post-stroke? Is that what you said?
Stroke, yeah. Had a
Oh.
stroke in October of 2016.
Well, you're looking good.
Yeah, well, the doc, I always make a joke of it, and I say that the doctor says I can talk. My friends are still wondering if that's a good thing or not.
Okay, great. Well, I agree with you. That's a very important topic. And certainly those missile silos are something that ought to keep us all awake. I don't think people think about them at all as if they're just part of the landscape. But my goodness, we got to do something about them there. So Reiner, I think you probably are very familiar with the topic of the nuclear silos, right?
You know, Frank, I think you opened a discussion which was also a part of my life. I was a schoolboy when I was going to the first anti-war demonstration against the Vietnam War. You know, I was punished at school and at home to go to these demonstrations. So it was really a part of my politicization and of my life. So thank you so much for remembering this. I think it is very important never to forget that we had this Vietnam War with a disaster, and now we had the Afghanistan war with, I will not say the same disaster, but again, with a deep political disaster. And it shows these interventions in foreign small countries also kills the country which has invaded the country. And so I can only say, you know, yeah, it brings us to the topic of nuclear weapons, because, you know, the consequences also of this Afghanistan war is not that the world is coming nearer together and find peaceful solutions. The consequences is all that we are going more to confrontation. You know, China and US, NATO and Russia, we can follow the story. And, you know, in every of these games, nuclear weapons are playing a key role. So I think it is really very, very dangerous. You know, we have the discussion about new land-based nuclear weapons around China, on the different islands in South Korea and in Japan. We have the modernization of the nuclear weapons in Europe, so the so-called B6112. We have the nuclear sharing, which means European countries are trained at the US nuclear weapons and should bring them into the goal when there's a political crisis or a war, which is definitely illegal against NPT treaty. So nuclear weapons for IPB is absolutely a key role. And, you know, we are 4 weeks after our IPB World Congress in Barcelona. And you ask for actions, and this World Congress with 900 participants in Barcelona and 1,700 online was a huge event. And, you know, when you would listen to this event, it was a very creative, optimistic idea of more actions and activities after the Corona pandemic. So it gives a little bit hope and power for future activities, above all by the nuclear weapons. And, you know, we have 2 events in front of us, which are deeply related to nuclear weapons. We have in January, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference in New York, where I think many street actions are needed to protest against the nuclear weapons. And we have, and this is a sign of hope, in March, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons First State Conference. This treaty, which was developed by the civil society, supported by some countries, now is an official UN law document accepted by more than 50 countries, have their first state conference. And I think this is a sign of hope that more people, more parliamentarians, even more governments, above all civil society, is really active against nuclear weapons. So I know also I was visiting these silos in Dakota. They are really a part of the landscape. Even when we are standing in front of them, you believe, are they totally stupid what they're building in this wonderful landscape? But, you know, they are dangerous. And the opposition about these nuclear weapons is growing, even when it is worldwide much too weak, but we are on a good start point, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned this recent conference in Barcelona. I, of course, as a previously active member in the IPB, would have liked to be there, but I couldn't. And in fact, I didn't even have time to watch it much on the Zoom. But maybe you can give us sometime or other in this conversation, give us kind of a précis of what all we missed. But I'd like to turn and ask Rael what's going on in Ottawa. How is the I mean, you can talk about whatever you want, but I want to know how the campaign is going to adopt in Canada a different voting system. And do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on there?
Sure. And I'd like to talk a little bit about my personal trajectory as well, because that's partly what we're doing here, is getting to know each other and finding out what we have in common. And when I saw that I would be sitting at the same table as two peaceniks, as we might call them, I kind of feel like a round peg in a square hole. But I've always been interested in international affairs myself, and most of my career has been focused around the issue of world poverty in one way or another. And I ended my career working for the Canadian International Development Agency, where I spent 12 years. Before that, I was with IDRC and so on. But when I retired, I kind of reset my strategy in terms of what kind of change I thought I might be able to work on in my retirement years. This was in 2013, that might make the most difference. And that's how I got involved. A little bit at a time. You start out being a volunteer, and first thing you know, you get roped in, and you're doing it full time, which is what happened to me. But I feel that if you can change the electoral system in countries like Canada, the UK, the US, in particular, I'm thinking of those, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, other countries that one might mention that are insufficiently democratic, that you stand a really good chance of improved performance on all fronts, because you have more diversity in your parliaments, and because you have, with that increased diversity, you are forced to have government by consensus across party lines. And when you do that, you're making policy in a different way than when you have a majority, often led by an all-powerful political leader. In Canada, our prime minister is one of the most powerful elected leaders in the world once elected. Basically, the leader can do what they want. They have the leverage over their own party, and their own party has the 100% leverage to pass any legislation that they want.
If
It's
they're a
extremely
majority
dangerous.
government. This
Pardon me?
one's not, if they're a majority government, but this government isn't. So maybe we should rejoice in the fact that it's a minority government, and it has to get some help from some other parties.
That helps, but we're always in danger of electing false majority governments in Canada, as we had under Stephen Harper. We had it under Justin Trudeau as well. We have it right now in Ontario under Doug Ford. And what that does is it gives one person a lot of power. And that kind of concentration of power leads to a particular way of making decisions, which involves inadequate consultation. It involves taking risks that might not be taken if decisions were made in a more consensual way. And to make that bridge, which is what I'm trying to do, is make the bridge between the three of us here. I would refer to an author, which you might be interested in looking at. His name is Salomon Orellana, and he wrote a book in 2014 called Electoral Systems and Governance. And that is one of the points that he argues very forcibly, that and it goes all the way down to engagement in war. There's a radical difference between governments based on proportional systems and governments based on winner-take-all systems in terms of their inclination to go to war. Yeah. There are more people in jails in winner-take-all countries. There's more terrorism in winner-take-all countries. So right down the list of indicators of how consensus-based a society is through to a more confrontational society, the voting system has a lot to do with that. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, Meta, but at least it creates a bridge between us here, that we're working on the same issue fundamentally in the end. Right. I'm working for a more consensus-based form of government in Canada, thinking that might create some inspiration for the United States and the UK, in which case it would have global ramifications as well. We're working really hard. We have to find the opportunities because, and this is where the bridge to the Citizens Assembly issue comes up. Changing an electoral system is fundamentally extremely difficult, because if you've been elected according to one system, why in the world would you want to change it? You want to be reelected. And that fundamental conflict of interest that politicians elected under one system are in is why you need a citizens' assembly. You need to find another way to hear from citizens what it is that they want. And a citizens' assembly is the best way we can think of to do that. So that's what we've been advocating for. And I can talk more about that later, but I think as introductions go, this is probably already as much as I should be saying before passing the floor on to other people.
Okay, then let me challenge you a little bit, and or maybe you could help me clarify something. When you say you don't want too powerful a government, well, we have the U.S. now, which is deadlocked. I mean, right now, Biden is certainly not too powerful. He can't get much through. You know, his program is probably not going to get through in anything like the form that he wants. So we do want a strong government, but at least now the difference is that what's dividing them is it's not that there's it's not just that there's a lack of consensus, but there's a tremendous polarization in the US now. So you have this polarization and a weak government, or that's why it's weak. Why would a proportional representation system make any difference? If let's say they established it in the US today, would it help, and why?
I think it would help greatly. When you look at the US, what you have is a very, very rigid two-party system. And within that system, basically the Republican Party has been taken over by the more extreme elements of that party. And voters, when they go to the polls, they have only those two choices, which a lot of people see as a choice between two evils. If you had a proportional system, people would have other choices that they could vote for. And so you would get more diversity in Congress than you have currently. You might even be able to elect a Ross Perot, the one third party candidate that achieved the highest result in a presidential election. You would also not be electing presidents based on an inferior share of the popular vote, as both George Bush and Donald Trump were elected that way in the United States. So you avoid the extremists taking power in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well now,
the whole issue of polarization in Congress and all that, I mean, I can't talk about that in any detail, obviously.
Okay. Well, connecting to what our concern is, Frank and Reiner and I are very worried about war issues and military issues. Now, Reiner lives in Berlin, and the German system of government, I think, would please you in that it's a proportional system. I don't really understand it. You've got two different things blended together there, Reiner, but I don't know whether you want to explain that to us. But the problem is that even with proportional representation, which is true not just in Germany, but a lot of European countries, maybe most, I don't know, it should be easier, since the majority of people would like to see nuclear disarmament. We should be able to get nuclear disarmament, but we don't. They don't budge either in terms of joining your side and my side. So Reiner, what's the problem there?
You know, it is interesting, Real. I agree and disagree with you. I definitely agree with you that a proportional system is much more democratic, because the loser does not take all. Every vote is represented in the parliament. I think that is really a democratic system.
Yeah.
And that is definitely the German system. We have a line where the parties are not coming into the parliament. They need 5%. So that all small parties is into parliament, that all the small parties can block the parliamentarian work. That is a critical discussion point in Germany, but we have this system. When you have 5% of the votes, you're in the parliament, and this means you can have you have different parties in parliament. We have 6, or in reality, even 7 parties in the parliament. So for the government, we need a coalition building, which is also a process of finding compromises. And it is not possible that one party is ruling alone with a vote. And the chancellor in Germany is not the king. He has always to see how he has to balance between in the government and also how to balance in the whole country, because we have also these two systems in Germany. We have on one side the parliamentarians, which is directly elected, and then we have a second so-called small parliament of the regional states. And all laws for the country, which are internal laws, must be also supported by the second parliament, by the so-called state parliament, Germany Bundesrat. This means even more balances, because the governments in the state parliaments must not be the same like in the central government. So we have really this balanced is a key point of our parliamentarian system. That is definitely positive. That does not mean that such a parliament makes positive decisions. And Meta was mentioned it. You know, you can also have between 6 parties the agreements for nuclear weapons, even when 75% of the German people saying they don't want to have it. So the critical voices you also have to mention against such a parliament. And you know, the German parliament, Germany is engaged in 13 wars. All these wars were supported by the German parliament, because the German army can only be engaged in war by vote of the parliament, because we have a so-called parliamentarian army. So these democratic system we have for electing a parliament does not mean that we have on one side an anti-war parliament, and does not mean that we have an anti-nuclear weapons parliament. This means civil society engagement. This means changing of the atmosphere in the society. This means influence of the different parties. A lot of democratic processes to change the behavior and the belief in the country. So yes, I'm in favor of a more proportional democratic system, because for me it is much more democratic. And on the other side, this is not, and this is the point I disagree maybe with you, this is not the point that the decisions are more anti-war and more peaceful than they are in Canada or in the United States.
Even a democratic society, and I would say the US is not, the problem is not that they're so undemocratic, but even with a highly democratic society, you can have some terrible decisions being made. You don't have any guarantee that democracy is going to produce better decisions than God knows what. I mean, the worst dictatorship in the world, even in terms of policies. I don't know, but I'm very worried about the future of democracy. And even it's not going to be solved by improving the voting system. It's got to be somehow solved by improving the stupidity of human beings. And I would say that you know, I'm seriously, I'm not kidding. I think, you know, people make really dumb decisions sometimes. So giving them the power to make more dumb decisions without thinking is very dangerous. Now, Rael, you mentioned the Citizens Assembly thing. The thing that appeals to me about a Citizens Assembly is they actually have to sit and think and talk and learn something before coming to reaching a policy recommendation. And it seems to me we have to have more of that in whatever system we have. It isn't so much that the voting system, well, I mean, that's good too, to change the voting system to make it more democratic, but only, I mean, that doesn't solve anything if you've got idiots, you know, who don't believe that there's such a thing as a pandemic going on, or you know, who believe that, you know, Donald Trump is their savior or something. What do you do with people like that when 40% of the US population is of that kind of mentality? And it's not just the US, it's global. I mean, all around the world, we have, you know, dictators or right-wing bigots in power. And it's not because of the voting problem, it's because of stupid people. What are you going to do about that?
Meta, if you look at my picture on the screen there, you'll see just over my right shoulder, there's a book there with a banner. I made a point of putting it there. It's called Too Dumb for Democracy, ? By
I
David
interviewed
Moss.
him. I called
Yeah.
David Moskrop
David
or something.
Musgrove,
Yeah.
yeah. And David is great. And one of the things that he recommends, so he asks the question, how rational are we as human beings? And the general answer is, well, we're not as rational as we think we are, as we would like to be. And Citizens Assembly is one of the issues that he puts forward. So I think that's a valid thing. What are the structures that you need in order to encourage people to be more rational, more evidence-based, more deliberative? Yes, a Citizens Assembly is one way to do that. But I would challenge you, Meta, that the electoral system helps a lot, because the evidence is that when a system is proportional, policy discussions, the nature of policy discussions actually changes. What we have in a winner-take-all system, like we have here in Canada, are all these hot issues, wedge issues, and that's what we focus on. You might remember I think it was the 2015 federal election. It was all about the burqa and things like that in Quebec. That was the issue of the day. We have these wedge issues, whereas in countries like Germany and other countries with proportional systems, the discussion is more mature, shall we say. The other thing is, that's because you live there, Reiner. That's what the evidence is. I'm looking at what the literature says, right? And if you look at the countries that are more prone to being taken over, and that I include Poland and Hungary and Turkey in that, and they're all proportional in quotes, but they're not proportional enough. They're insufficiently proportional, and as a result, it allowed that populist right-wing faction to take power, and that leads to a completely different form of government.
If you can show that it's really a problem of their system, what's wrong with the Turkish parliamentary system or voting system?
Those three countries that I mentioned all have proportional systems with features that make it possible for a country to win a false majority government. This happened in Poland, in Hungary, and in Turkey. In Turkey,
no, we have a coalition government in Poland.
That's right, but the one party has almost 50% of the vote, if I remember right. I haven't looked at it.
44 and 8, yeah. These are,
it's
but
very,
it's
very close.
coalition
So they have to
government.
compromise a little bit, but not that much. So that's my general point there. I'm sorry, I've lost my own train of thought now. Oh yeah, the Turkey case. What makes Turkey less proportional? They have a 10% threshold before a country can win any seats. You have to win 10% of the popular vote countrywide before you get any list seats. So what that means is you end up with fairly disproportional results. It's not that we disagree, Meta, but I thought this was an important qualifier. It has more importance than you might think.
Well, I exaggerated the difference by diminishing the importance of the voting system in order to make my point about stupid people. But I agree, both are relevant.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in Frank's view of what's happening in the U.S. now, and whether or not, what's the basic problem there. I would say the U.S. is in the worst shape I've ever seen it or can remember. I'm not a historian, so there may be times that have been just as bad. But honestly, I'm very pessimistic about the future in the U.S. What do you think, Frank?
I am temperamentally an optimist. That's why I was a draft board reader and thinking you could change things. Just by the by, you can't even commit that crime anymore because all the records are computerized, which is another industry that I helped sort of bring into the, having been both in prison and having had a stroke, I've sort of seen myself sometimes as a survivor. It's like, all this stuff that's happened out there. You have to have, reality, you have to have sort of a real belief in the common person that you're going to show them something and they're going to make an intelligent decision. Well, I question that. I mean, I wish that was true. I mean, I've also been a college teacher. Maybe I didn't mention that. So that, I've been there trying to talk to young people about the type of topics we're talking about. And you would think that people would learn, but you see where generation passes down incomplete stories. Now, I come from the generation that had the most incomplete story because, we knew nothing about what was going on in society. We were shocked to find out that women didn't have opportunity. We were shocked to find out there was racism in the country. We were shocked to find out that America was built on slavery. was shocked to find out that the very few people actually who formed this country initially were men, and they kept women out. Women were not part of it. So in the 60s, we had to go, oh. So I already had my bachelor's degree when I found out that basically none of my professors told me the full story. I had to spend all my time, as many people did in the 60s, reading all these books about things that we never knew about.
Mhm.
So Ryan, you'd be interested in this. I mean, Kroenke is a German-based name. My family's from the Hanover area, but because of World War II, I grew up, my father's name is Charles Otto Kroenke, and not unsurprisingly, he was a chemist. He went to Notre Dame, which is one of our more elite Catholic schools. But we never talked about Germany. Well, you understand why. You know, it's like, you know, when he joined the military, the Navy, when my mother was pregnant with me, and I'm the fourth child. He already had 3 kids. Ends up having 9. It's another story, but and he very vigorously opposed what I was doing. He said, "Who are you, Frank, to oppose the government and the church?"
Hmm.
Both
You're
of
talking
which I said,
opposing the U.S. government. Is that what he objected to?
They both went off the rail. I mean, the Catholic Church was not giving moral guidance to people, and in America, we still want to talk about World War II as our good war. I mean, there's no good war. I mean, the fact is, lots of people die. We vaporize people in Hiroshima, which is my birthday, by the way, August 6th. But we don't talk about that honestly. And if you lived in the States here, August 6th, you never hear anything about Hiroshima anymore.
Mhm. Let me
So-
ask you a question. You've been in prison. Now, I've been saying that most most voters are too ignorant to make smart decisions, or a hell of a lot of them, maybe half of them are too dumb to make good decisions. And that to me is a real problem, because we've got to live with the decisions we make. Now, you've been in a place where people are not famed for being brilliant. And I presume you know a lot of prisoners and ex-prisoners. Now, suppose the prison were run democratically, and all of the people in prison were given a vote to decide what should be done, how to run the place. Would it be a better place, or would it be worse than the way it's run now? Do voters have enough sense? I mean, people who are not necessarily, you know, geniuses, but do the average prisoners have enough sense to make sensible decisions, or would you say they would make stupid ones?
You ask me these profound questions that there's no simple answer to. I mean, part of the problem is, maybe some of you already know this, but in America basically created the modern, what's called penitentiary. Now look at that word, penitentiary. We in America have something called the civil religion, which is the mixture of religious and politics. And prison was one example. The same men who formed the Constitution and Declaration of Independence met in a private society called the Pennsylvania Prison Society that still exists today, and thought of prisons. And prisons were supposed to reform you. We call them reformatories. And they're penitentiaries. You go in there and you have this personal experience of penance, and you ask for forgiveness, and you want to go out and lead a new life. Well, even if guys have that experience, which some do, of wanting to reform their lives and realize how stupid things are, once you get out, like now, the very first thing I have to tell anybody is I'm an ex-con. They don't ask me to explain it. Once you just have to say, oh yeah, I'm an ex-con. It's like, hey, I'm a Martian. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, they don't want to let you back in. Now, I've been successful in the business world, but I was in the startup world. I was in that fringe part of the corporate world, not the main part. I mean, main companies wouldn't hire me. All I have to, if they don't talk to me, if they just read my resume, and then if they say, well, we checked you out and you were in prison, they would not want to trust me with their money or do anything, right? So,
Well, yeah, but you're not a typical prisoner. What I'm asking you is,
I understand
take your guess about the typical prisoner that you knew. Do they have, would they make good, any worse or any better political decisions than the average person who's never been to prison?
Probably not. I mean, sometimes you say, how did you get here? And they tell you what they did, and you say, you thought you were going to get away with that? I mean, the small, they have the sort of a small view of the world. It's sort of a trap. You get people who have screwed up, and instead of helping them, which was the original idea, to reform and to be penitent and stuff like that, the very first prison created in America, the Eastern States Penitentiary, did not have a chaplain for 45 years because they felt that the system itself, the penitentiary, was it was created by basically the Quakers. It was a quasi-religious experience. Well, we don't have that today. Basically, you're a piece of manure.
But I'm trying to figure out how to get the average voter or enough voters in a population to have good sense so that I can be hopeful that a real democratic system will produce decisions that will enable us to survive. Because as it stands now, the voters are not doing the things that are necessary to allow humankind to survive. I predict, and I'm sorry to predict it, but we're going to have very close to an extinction event, because if it's not climate change, it's going to be nuclear war. And if it's not nuclear war, it's going to be famine and you name it. So I'm worried because people are, even COVID, they won't even do the things that are necessary to help us cure a disease. So what I want to know is, if you took a whole bunch of prisoners, the average bunch of prisoners, selected the way Rael would like to select them for a citizens' assembly, and you put them through whatever it is that a citizens' assembly does, would they make decisions that are as smart as we need to have made? Or are they going to continue to make stupid decisions regardless of how much information is put through them and in front of them? And Rael can give me that answer as well as you can, because everybody's got a good guess about what's going to happen there, and I'm worried about it.
I basically agree with you that it's hard to be optimistic. The traditional ex-convict is somebody who's raised poorly, dropped out of school, tried to take a quick way of making money. Their crimes are oftentimes a very logical and positive response to all the negativity that they were forced to experience as a young person. They look at me and they say, yeah, you go out and you work 40 hours a week and you make $1,000. I can do that in one robbery. It was always hard.
Rael, I'd like your opinion about you've had some experience with taking an average cross-section of the population and putting them through something. Now, what does the Citizens Assembly do that's supposed to turn them into more thoughtful voters? And would you be willing to take a bunch of prisoners and see if you could do the same thing with them?
Oh, absolutely. I always get inspired by watching movies of experiences where you take people who have had a difficult experience and bring them together in a facilitated way so that they engage in true dialogue, respect diversity, develop empathy, all of those things. I'm not making any guarantees about how it would work in the prison context, but the way that citizens' assemblies work, now you elect people by sortition and you have to be willing to participate, but essentially you're bringing together a diversity of people who have different views, but you start off the discussion by discussing the general principles that you want to surround the issue that you're dealing with. So if you're doing a citizens' assembly on democratic reform, for example, the first thing you would ask is, well, what are we looking for in a democracy? And you anchor the discussion around those principles. And what that does is it allows people to engage in a different way than one that's just based on your positions or opinions going in, because you're digging a little bit deeper. And what the research has found in the case of the two citizens' assemblies that we've had in Canada, one in Ontario and one in BC, is that it was remarkable the extent to which an intelligent conversation was had and the extent to which it was not a partisan discussion. People overcame their partisan differences that they might have had going in order to come to what was largely a consensus at the end, with maybe 4 or 5% dissenting. There's always going to be some people who dissent, and you need to have that dissenting report as at the end. But if you have a consensus that's quite large, you've gone a long way. Now, the issue you're talking about, Meta, is the issue of climate change, and is an extremely difficult one. And I would like to point out that one of the areas where citizens' assemblies are being organized and have been organized recently at both the country level and globally is in the area of climate change. There was one that Macron put together in France, which delivered its results not very long ago. And there's one in the UK as well. And then there's a global citizens' assembly on climate change, the details of which I'm not so familiar with, but reported its results, its preliminary results at COP26. So the idea exists, and it is considered to be one of those thorny issues where bringing together citizens in a deliberative way is going to give you results that are quite different than what you get just from listening to what people have to say in the polls or man in the street kind of thing.
Okay, were the results of these two assemblies, or however many you know of, were they in any one direction? In other words, were they more demanding of drastic action than the general population, or than the delegates to the COP meetings?
Yes, generally speaking, a citizens' assembly leads to bolder recommendations than politicians themselves might call for. And you have to ask the questions in an intelligent way, or else all you get is motherhood and apple pie. That's not what we want. We want citizens to be dealing with the difficult questions and say, okay, well, we as citizens, here are the sacrifices we're prepared to make. We're prepared to pay a carbon tax or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what we want to see. And in both France and in the UK, they came back with some very pro climate action policy recommendations. And that was, in fact, what Macron was betting on, because you might remember with the Yellow Vest movement, he had tried to put some things in and he got some pushback from people who weren't willing to pay those taxes or make those sacrifices. So he put it up to a citizens' assembly, which came back with quite strong recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Reiner, did you start to say something?
You know, I really would like to continue a little bit with Frank. Frank, when you were speaking about your story as a child, I again remember the story of my growing up. My father was a soldier in the German fascist army, and he was educated at the so-called Napola, which was a fascist elite school. And as a schoolboy, I found, when I was 15, a book in our library. We had many books at home. And I opened the book, and the book was written Reichswehr 1944, Kiev. And then I made a research what happened in 1944 in Kiev. And this was the closing of the Yiddish ghetto in Kiev. And all these Yiddish people were sent to Theresienstadt and to Auschwitz. And I asked my father, have you seen that? What's happened there? And he was only crying and shouting against me. No explanation, nothing. Little bit this, yeah. He became a Democrat on the 9th of May, 1945. So that is also a part of our story for growing up and for becoming critical, because, as a young boy, when my father was shouting and crying at me, I was interested in this topic and make more research, or looking to more books in our library and go to the public library. And so that is also a part of our life, where we start thinking about the fascist period and the silence of our parents. It was never a topic at home. The time from 1933 to 1945 does not exist at home. And then also at school, the historical lectures at school ended with the Weimar Republic. There was no time any longer. The season was over. So
Wait a minute,
that is a
just a sec. Oh, you're talking about when you were during the war, there was no talk. But after 1945, there was a lot of talk, wasn't there?
no, but there was no family talk.
Okay.
There was no discussion. I was born in 52. I finished school at 72. So this was 67, 68. At that time, when the students were on the streets and make the rebellion, there was in the many, many families, no discussion about this time. It was quiet. It does not exist. And the question in many families, definitely not in all, but in many more conservative families like mine, was a dead question. It does not exist. So that is, and these changed with the student rebellion. And then in the 70s, with all the activities, then we had these films, you remember the Holocaust films, and. These changed the discussion and the behavior in the society. Otherwise, the so-called Ostpolitik, the policy of détente of Willy Brandt would never be possible, because this changed the atmosphere in the society. And then maybe the highlight or a key point for this change was the speech of Richard von Weizsäcker as president of Germany, when he said Germany becomes free at the May 8th. Because up to now, it was either we were losing or it was a so-called hour zero, Stunde Null. So that was a huge process in our growing up, where you could see that people also could change society.
But you were part of it in the 70s, is that right?
And I was part of it I was student in the 70s. I had many responsibilities in the student politics in the 70s. I started growing up and changing to critical positions at school. My last teacher, who in Germany is called class teacher, was coming from the university. We were his first class. And he was a member at that called SDS, Socialist Student Organizations at that time, which was a left-wing student organization. And he brought new thoughts. I learned the name Zuckmayer, Bertolt Brecht, Sänger, so many of these names, which are for you and very familiar now, but they were not a part of the societal debate at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s.
What did it do to your relationship with your father when you made this bold move as a young political activist? How did he take it?
Till to the end of my father's life, we had never really good relations. When I was a student, he was saying to me, "You will end on the street with all your thoughts." So I was growing up in opposition, mainly to my father. My mother was mainly quiet to my father. And, at the end, and when I was elder and he becomes really old, it becomes a little bit more relaxed relation. But it never was a really friendly relations. It was a deep break between us. It was on Christmas, I think it was 72 or 73. I was at home. I was a student, come back at home for Christmas. And at this Christmas evening, the US was bombing North Vietnam terribly. And we were showing this in TV. And I was saying, these horrible, brutal US guys, it is impossible what they're doing. And he said to me, "Go home, leave my house."
Wow. Whew.
And I'm not telling this because this is a very special story of mine. This is in in other relations, maybe sometimes not so strong, but even sometimes stronger. A story of quite a generation, maybe even two generations were growing up in the same atmosphere, starting in the middle of the 60s till to the beginning of the 70s.
But Rainer, it's not just Germany. Now I'm 90 years old, and I guess I was 14 when the nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. My parents both worked at a military base, an Air Force base, where they were providing the supplies for these bombings. Probably they may have, helped bomb the Hiroshima, Nagasaki without knowing it. but we will never know that. But the thing is, they were not at all guilty about their thing. I remember being brought up at 14 when I read that the nuclear bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. I was delighted.
Yeah.
That's the mindset that was prevalent. Nobody differed from me. Everybody I knew had the same attitude. We were glad because we're going to win the war now. And that's all that counted. So,
I will only say,
I'm still living with that the memory
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I was glad about that. And it'll haunt me all my life. But go on.
let me say, as a German, there is a specific role when you are a German. We were killing 6 million Jewish people. And we are responsible for 27 million dead Soviet Union soldiers.
Mhm,
We attacked and destroyed whole Europe.
mhm,
Not only in our country, the opposition end. That is a very specific, singular historical responsibility we have. And this changed the behavior definitely of many generations in the 60s and the 70s. But it was a fight with our parents. For them, these 12 years was a mistake. And after 12 years, it was over. Then they were Democrats. Frankly speaking, they were never Democrats. Also, my teacher were never Democrats. They had the fascist behavior in themselves, many of them. Even when they partly were polite and were never speaking fascist language, but they have it. So, and this changed, and this is a big success. And I'm saying this a little bit where I'm thinking that the development of human beings depends very much of the development and the atmosphere in the society. How a society develop young people, how a society educate young people, how is the atmosphere in a society? Is it individualistic? Is everyone fighting against everyone? Or is it for common sense? Have you possibilities for understand that solidarity is something important? Or only do you learn to fight against the neighbor as your enemy? So, and this is the atmosphere, I think, of solidarity we really developed in the 17th. And I'm really proud of it to be a part of this time and also be an active part of this time. And, when I'm looking now with these neoliberalistic destroyment of societies all over the world, then it is for me a logical consequence that people are becoming stupid, that people believe everything, that people are becoming also right-wing voters, and this is also the result of what's happened during the last 25 or 30 years. Now we see the consequences in the whole brutality. And we, the critical voices, are not strong enough to develop a counter atmosphere to this atmosphere in the society. And I can tell you stories about Germany. We have a right-wing party with 10% in the parliament, and we are happy that it's not only 10%, it was 16% by the last elections.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
It was what?
16% by the last election.
16. And
The AfD lost 6%.
Do you worry that they may grow, or what do you think is going to happen? I mean, go on.
The good point is that we really create a huge opposition against the AfD with a lot of actions. And we also make a lot of telling about their program, informing the people, making public awareness what they were doing, really a lot of activities. And this reduced the influence of the right wing. It does not destroy the influence, but it will reduce the influence. So they lost about 6% by the last elections.
Mhm.
So you can reduce the influence, but 10% is a lot of people when you have 84 million people in your country. So don't forget that. And it is wrong to say these are only old people. There are also a lot of young people. We have young fascists, we have young right-wing people, we have young people which are believing every stupid idea. That is not only the elder generation. So, but all these could grow under this huge challenge in the society in the last 30 years. And I think this is, this neoliberalistic capitalistic system destroys so many things. Above all, it destroys society, it destroys the solidarity of the society, and it also destroys a solidarity thinking in the society. Look, what are learning people at the university? For me, university was a cultural center. I love to go to university because I had free time, I could learn, I could discuss, I could teach. I have also free time for specific other activities around the normal teaching. What is this today? Today, it's the brutal education learning system. In your mind, and next week you have to write a test. And at the end, you have to write the next text. They don't have any time for any education system. I read all these critical books at and around university time. These students today have no time to do it. When they should do it?
I haven't taught now for several years, so I'm not totally in favor, in touch with this generation at all of students. But I've been talking to people teaching peace studies in the US, and they are very hopeful. They say their students are terrific. But then how many of them are, they happen to be teaching peace studies. So how many?
I can tell this for Germany. We have 1,200,000 students in Germany, and we have 1,500 which are studying peace education and peace science in a broader sense.
1,000 out of 1 million?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
That is also neoliberalistic reality.
Yeah, well, not so good. Okay, well, we're closing toward the end. I want to give both Frank and Real one or two words to say by way of conclusion. Frank, what can you quickly sum up what you think about the future of democracy in the U.S.?
Yeah, so one of the lessons I learned in my life, I'm 77 now, is that things never turn out the way I think they are. In one sense, that's hopeful because things look pretty bleak sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so I'm much more like Real and Reiner. I still think you're very optimistic. And I am too. I think that younger people, just like we were in our generation, will come up and figure things out. So
Thank you.
I keep basically a positive attitude about things. I do think, again, that things like peace and love win out, even after all the suffering that individuals experience, soldiers as well as people like myself. So,
okay, thank you very much. Okay, and Real, you get the last word.
We wouldn't be doing it if we weren't hopeful, Meta. You have to have hope in order to make progress. This area that I'm involved in, getting electoral reform, is a very difficult one. But one has to be really strategic. You have to understand what the constraints are and go for the soft spots. And in this particular situation now, the next Ontario election is going to be a really big one because there's a very good chance that we're going to end up with a minority government in which 3 of the parties would be favorable to electoral reform. So we need to get them to promise a citizens' assembly and move from there.
All right, I'm on your side. Very good. Thank you all. This has been fascinating. I don't know whether we talked about the same subject or not. There were overlapping concerns, but we certainly covered a lot of different territories too, didn't we? Thank you very much. Okay, it's been fun. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.